The book of Acts has 3 pivot points. The first one's very famous. We've been making a lot of it in this course. Acts 8:1. A great persecution arises, and the believers are scattered. The gospel then is on the move, jumping barriers, crossing borders, transcending boundaries, thanks to persecution. And there's a third pivot point in chapter 21:30, when the Apostle Paul is arrested in Jerusalem. And the rest of the book becomes the story of Paul the prisoner and his 5 legal defenses, which of course will take him all the way to Rome, where the story will climax. But the second pivot point is right here in 11:25. And it's very important, but it doesn't look like it. Have you ever seen a quieter verse than this? And Barnabas went to Tarsus to find Saul. That's all. But maybe it's not an exaggeration to say that most of us are watching this course as Christians today because of this. This enables the gospel to go to the Gentiles. The Jerusalem church is replaced by the church in Antioch. Peter, the great apostle, is replaced by Paul as the preeminent missionary of the church. The center of gravity of the early church shifts right here. It's thanks to Barnabas, who put Antioch and Saul together. He made a new connection that would change the world. But it didn't look like it at the time. Let me sneak up to the significance of this with a question. Do you want to be great for God, or do great things for God? I remember the great evangelist Billy Graham dying just a few years back, and it was staggering to see the amount of people he had preached to. Just physically, I think it was something like 210 million in stadiums, and then of course billions more through broadcast media. That's greatness, that's influence. And I'm sure he looked back on his life with some satisfaction and joy. Few get to see their own fruit so clearly. But if you or me want to be great for God, who's our model? Where's our template? If you want to be a great evangelist and your hero is Billy Graham, how are you doing? You'd need counseling very rapidly because you couldn't measure up. I was raised in a very Christian family, and the tradition was to read what was called an improving book on a Sunday. It usually meant a missionary biography of somebody like Hudson Taylor or C.T. Studd, John Wesley, John G. Payton. Great men, all of them. But there was a problem, and that was the terror of never measuring up to them. If you got up at 5 a.m. to pray, there was a voice inside you that said, Hudson Taylor would have been up at 3. The whole thing was a recipe for discouragement. I'll never be Hudson Taylor. I'll never be a William Wilberforce. I'll never be a Billy Graham. Does this resonate? Those of you who are older, when you look back on your life, like me, you sometimes think, gosh, I thought I would have more to show for it than this. I had such hopes and dreams, but it's all turned out a bit ordinary, or maybe even, whisper it, a bit underwhelming. But this affects people who are younger too. Young people very often have great dreams, but many of them find that they can't get greatness started. Maybe they wanted to be a great doctor, but they couldn't get the grades to get into the right school. Maybe you want to have a wonderful marriage, but the person you're in love with doesn't feel the same way, and you're waiting for life to start. Well, here's a thought that comes straight out of this little verse, which I hope will come as a comfort. Could greatness not so much be about a lifetime of achievements, but about a moment of connection? a moment of importance rather than a list of achievements. Does the Bible redefine greatness for us in a way that is far more inclusive and far more radical? As we said, this is a key pivot point in the book of Acts. A man called Barnabas goes and finds a person called Saul, who at that time, of course, was about to be renamed Paul. Simple. Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul, and when he found him, he brought him back to Antioch. And the rest is history. I'm sure Barnabas had no idea how significant the moment of connection was going to be. But from now on in the story, it's really all about Paul, not Barnabas, though he is with Paul for some of the time. And he fades away. Barnabas is the hinge. He's the one who recruits the person who will play the greatest role in bringing the gospel to the world at large. But as the story goes on, he becomes more and more of a hidden hinge. I was reading a book recently, and it was about a man who had been a fireman, and he was also a captain of a ferry boat in Southern California. And he wanted to be great for God. So he went off to the Philippines, and he began to be an evangelist to students. He was hopeless at it. He actually admitted he was a hopeless evangelist. And he was sitting in some despair one day in a coffee shop in Manila. And a large American man, whose name was Doug Sutphin, came in, and they started talking. And this man said, "You know, I'm looking for somebody who can captain a tugboat. I just bought one in Singapore, and I need a man to captain it and tow a barge with 1 million Bibles to the Chinese coast in one night." That was called Project Pearl. And this man said, "I have a captain's certificate. I could do it." And so he did. That was his moment. And then he writes up the rest of his life. He goes back to evangelism, and he's not very good at it again. But it's interesting that looking back in his 80s, over his life, he said, "I'm okay with this. I was ready for my moment. And when it came, I did it. I can't count a series of achievements. There was really only one, but that's enough." I think it was the great preacher Charles Spurgeon. He was once asked, if you had 25 years to live, what would you do with them? And he answered, "I would spend 24 of them in preparation." Now, Barnabas has been prepared, of course. He was a founder member of the church in Jerusalem. He was the one who befriended Paul there when everybody else was keeping their distance. He was known as a great preacher too. Maybe he was even a more exciting event than Paul, to be honest, since that's really what son of encouragement means. That's his name explained, and it could mean great speaker. He has great credibility, and that's the reason why he's sent to Antioch in the first place, because the Jerusalem leaders are worried about what is happening there, and they say, find out if it's really of the Spirit. And Barnabas realizes when he gets there that it is. All these Gentiles becoming believers is a good thing. God's in it. But he also knows he can't handle the implications for discipleship, for mission. And that's why he goes and finds Paul. And that's the primary reason he's in the story. He's the hinge that connects Paul to the mission of the church. Yes, I think there's something here for all of us, a comfort. Is it not a good thing that maybe life is not measured in terms of decades of achievement for God, but it is enough to have a moment of connection, a moment of faithfulness, a moment of bravery. It could take many forms. Doesn't that sound like the kingdom? Because it then includes everyone. Absolutely everyone. We can't all achieve. We can't all be great figures. We can't all be billionaires. We can't all be Nobel Prize winners. We can't all be famous pastors. We can't all be book writers. God knows this. And so he has set up the kingdom differently. I remember once traveling about China, and I was writing a little book about the role of Christian women in China. Their contribution somehow never seemed to get mentioned or written up. And there was one story that has really stuck with me. A girl was born with Down's syndrome. And she was born into a Christian family, but nobody really understood the condition, and she was not treated well. She was the niece of a great house church leader, actually, but nothing was expected of her. She wasn't even taught to read. And they managed to find her a job when she turned 17, I think, as a petrol pump assistant. And she could only hold that job down for 3 weeks. She's never worked since. But one day, when she was doing this, a car drew up. And there were 4 men in it. And they rolled down the windows and said, "We are the Public Security Bureau. Fill it up. The government will pay." And she began to fill the tank. But then she overheard them speaking. And she realized that these officers were on their way to arrest her uncle, who was this house church leader. And so her heart beat very fast, and she made a fateful decision that she knew could land her in jail for a very long time. She stopped filling the tank. She pretended to keep filling it, but she stopped. And she ended up only filling it about a quarter. She never told anyone. She never really heard anything. 2 years later, she was talking to her uncle, and she told him this story. And he began to realize the significance of her action, because on that very day, all the leaders from his top 5 house church networks, which were over millions of people, were meeting at his house. It was very rare. They only got together once every 10 years. And that particular meeting had passed without incident, but thanks to his niece, who had effectively stranded the security officers. If the leaders had been arrested, the uncle concluded it would have set the house churches back years in that area. And he thought, a moment of bravery from an overlooked, underrated little saint. And she saved the entire leadership of China's house church network in that area. She was a hidden hinge, a bit like Barnabas.